There was a new pastor at the Baptist church in town getting ready for stewardship season. And so she asked the treasurer for a report on the giving records of all the members. And the pastor was startled to find that one of the wealthiest members of the congregation had never given. And so this new pastor bravely set up a meeting with the man, and when he came, she said to him, "You know, I read the annual report of your company. It lists your salary at $10 million. But I noticed that you've never given to the church. May I ask you why?" The man replied, "How presumptuous of you. Did the report mention my mother is ill with extremely large medical bills? Or that I have 3 children at expensive private schools? Or that my brother, who has a wife and kids, was injured in an accident and can't work? Did the report tell you any of that?" The pastor said, "No." "Well," the man concluded, "if I don't give any money to them, why would I give any money to the church?" We all know what it looks like when someone is not generous, but we sometimes have a harder time determining and discerning what generosity is or why we're called to be generous people. During this season of stewardship, we're going to be inviting you to take a journey with us on the road to generosity. We're asking you to take the time over this few weeks to look into your hearts, to think about your life, to ask the question, what is generosity? Am I being called to go further on the road to generosity? Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Oh no, I've come to church on the Sunday of the dreaded stewardship sermon. How could I be so unlucky? Is there any way to get out of here now? That'll teach me to read the weekly. First, I'd like to say, greeters, if you could please lock the doors. Second, I want to say, friends, we're in this together. From preacher to people, from pulpit to pew, we all moan about stewardship season, which is why I thought about taking a page out of the NPR's playbook and telling you that if we meet our goal before the campaign is over, I'll preach on a different topic next Sunday. Why does everyone dread stewardship season? I think the reason is that nobody wants to talk about money, especially in church. We see the church like a giant dinner table with our family where certain topics are off limits, like sex and politics and money. I'd add religion, but I think you're supposed to talk about religion in church. The irony is that the average Christian would rather talk about sex or even politics in church than money. In fact, by the end of this stewardship series, some of those who've been longing for me to approach new topics in sermons will be begging for me to go back to preaching about social justice. That's how much we hate talking about money in church. We want our money to be a private matter, a secret affair that is hidden from our fellow church members and our neighbors, the world, even from ourselves. But the secret and hidden and taboo nature of money is what makes it so powerful. It's what gives money such an intense grip on all of our lives. Things are always more powerful when they are hidden. Philosopher Michel Foucault wrote, "Power is only tolerable on the condition that it masks a substantial part of itself, and its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms." No one can deny that money has an extraordinary power over our lives, which means that if we want to loosen the grip money has over us or liberate ourselves from the power it has over our communities, we need to talk about it. We cannot free ourselves from anything that has power over us until we name it. That's what powerful things don't want us to do. They don't want us to name them. Because once we name them, then we can see them. And I heard somebody once say, once you can name something, then you can tell it what to do. The great composer and social activist Bernice Johnson Reagan, who founded the Freedom Singers and Sweet Honey in the Rock, wrote a song where she named the power of money. She sang these lyrics: "I've been thinking about how to talk about greed. I've been wondering if I could sing about greed, trying to find a way to talk about greed." She writes, "Greed is a poison rising in this land, the soul of the people twisted in its command. It moves like a virus, seeking out everyone. Greed never stops, and its work is never done. Creeping, choking, killing, invading everywhere." She says, "There's really no escaping greed's sneaky snare. Not partial to gender or sexual desires, all it wants for you is to want, to own, possess, and to buy. Nothing seems to stop it when it enters your soul, has you buying anything, spending out of control. It moves within the culture, touching us all. Greed really isn't picky. It'll make anybody fall." Then she sings, "Maybe you don't know exactly what I mean. You don't really want to know about you and your greed. You may wonder if you're infected by greed." She says, "If you have to ask, that's all you really need." Bernice had a gift for naming the power. But naming is just the beginning. We also need an activity to follow the naming process that can break us free from the powerful death grip that money has over our lives. Scholar Walter Brueggemann calls that activity radical generosity. He claims that an immense act of generosity is the very thing that is required to break the death grip of fear, anxiety, and greed. He says we live in a system of anxiety and fear, and we have no time or energy for the common good because anxiety causes us to focus our total attention on ourselves at the expense of others. But overwhelming generosity can redirect our energies away from anxiety and toward an investment in the common good. He writes, "A surprising act of generosity beyond our categories of expectation is often the only thing that has the power to break the deathly pattern of anxiety and fear and greed. When we are immersed in such immense generosity," he says, "we're able to get our minds off of ourselves for once and focus on the work of loving our neighbors. It's precisely an inexplicable act of generosity that delivers us from the cycle of scarcity and frees our lives for community." You know, the most fascinating thing about our text today from Matthew 6 is not actually Jesus' words about avoiding hypocrisy, though that word does jump out at from the text. The most fascinating thing are Jesus' presuppositions. Did you notice in the text, Jesus didn't say, "You should give money." He didn't even say, "If you give money." He said, "When you give." Not if, when you give. Jesus presumed his audience was already giving. Now that's why I know that Jesus was a lunatic. How could he make such a ridiculous presumption? He talked about money more than any other topic in all of the Gospels, yet it's incredible to me that of all the things Jesus said about money, he never actually told people or commanded them to give. That's because he presumed they were already doing it. He presumed that they knew giving was one of the fundamental acts of those who seek to live in relationship with God and to follow him. You see, Jesus' followers were all Jewish for the most part, which means they already had commands in the Hebrew Bible to give generously to their neighbors. It was a part of their culture, their society. Jesus never tried to explain to people why people should give. Instead, he simply told his followers how, because he thought they were already doing it. Now, sadly, it is not as self-evident to Christians today that we are called to give. Which means that if Jesus were here this morning, he'd have to start with us from a completely different place. He'd probably say something like, "When you give," and we would interrupt him and ask, "Jesus, what do you mean by when?" In Matthew 6, Jesus presumed another idea that seems radical to most Christians today. That giving is actually the most important and fundamental spiritual practice. More important than prayer and fasting. Look how he ordered these spiritual instructions at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't begin with prayer or fasting and say that giving comes after. He began with giving, he returned to giving, and he ended with giving. Giving is the alpha, mu, and omega of this text. And according to Jesus, prayer is actually a practice we engage in to remind us why we give. So everyone receives their daily bread and their daily wages, so that financial debts are forgiven, so that the kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. And according to Jesus, fasting is actually a practice we engage in to spend less money on our own insatiable desires so we can free up money to give away to the poor. At the end of the day, prayer and fasting are both about money and giving. For Jesus, prayer and fasting can only be understood through the lens of generosity. And this is what drives me crazy today about all the talk of spirituality in our world. The New Age spirituality, the millions of Americans who now identify as spiritual but not religious. There's never been a form of spirituality that did not begin and end with generosity. Not Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, Christian, indigenous, or any other true spirituality. There is simply no spirituality without generosity. All forms of spirituality take account of our material reality. If not, they're actually a form of what we call spiritual bypassing. Something that uses spirituality to avoid the material world, that uses spirituality to deny the struggle of daily life or to avoid the hard truths of human existence, like the fact that we have to deal with money. We can't deny the reality of money, no matter how hard we try. We can't transcend money or escape the real world of money by living in a delusional fantasy land. Jesus talked directly about money more than anything else and put our money and what we do with our money at the very foundation of our spirituality. I thank my mother for trying so hard to teach me this lesson at an early age. When I was in middle school, about the age of my daughter now, she gave me a 3-ring binder with 5 plastic envelopes inside. And each month, she would give me an allowance for doing my chores, and she told me to divide it into these 5 envelopes. One envelope was for lunch money, one envelope was for clothes, buying clothes, one was for savings, one was for church, and one was for fun. Now, as a middle schooler, the temptation to take the money set aside for church, right? You already know it. You know where I'm going. And spend it on something else was monumental. It was a monumental temptation. And I succumbed to that temptation more than a few times. In fact, when I was telling my mother this story, that I was going to tell this story yesterday, she said, remind the congregation that you also conned somebody to get their card, their ID card, so that you could get free and reduced lunch, so that you could take the lunch money from your friend and use that lunch money for something else. So it's confession time today. So she wanted you to know that I was already thinking strategically as a child. But it's the lesson of those envelopes, the lesson stayed with me despite all my failing. I learned that giving is a spiritual practice, a war with temptation, a necessary part of my life, a critical activity I was called to do with my money. And I have to say that as an adult, my parents made an even stronger impression on me as I watched them throughout their lives tithe 10% of their income to their church faithfully and sacrificially, even through tremendous financial difficulty, even when my father was sick after a heart attack, even when my brother was in the hospital, continuing that loyalty and fidelity to their church, to God. Our deacons might want to call my parents and see if they might be willing to move their membership here over to Myers Park Baptist Church. What really stings about Jesus' teaching in Matthew 6 is that whenever we try to be spiritual without being generous with our money, we're just like the hypocrites he warned the disciples about. The word hypocrite comes from the Greek theater. It means to put on a mask, to play, to act, to pretend to be something. Jesus used it to describe people who possess that wide separation between theory and practice, faith and works, word and deed. People who talk the talk but do not walk the walk. There are a lot of people out there today pretending to be followers of Jesus. They say that they're spiritual, but they haven't let Jesus into their finances yet. They say that they're spiritual, but they haven't let Jesus look at their investments yet. They say they're spiritual, but they won't follow Jesus with their money. They say they're spiritual, but they aren't really interested in generosity. Society tells us that we should actually be generous for a whole host of reasons. The scientists at UC Berkeley have discovered amazing evidence that humans are biologically wired for generosity, that generosity activates the same reward pathways in the brain as food and sex. Now, we Baptists have always linked generosity and food, our potluck lunches, but I think we've really missed an opportunity not connecting stewardship and sex, right? We really need to consider this for our next stewardship campaign. I can see the slogan now. Giving to Myers Park Baptist Church is as good as sex. Don't believe me? Try it. Just try it and see what happens. The researchers at Berkeley also found a strong link between generosity and happiness. People are actually happier when they give. And even more than that, they found that giving is associated with better health, delayed mortality, as well as psychological health and well-being. And with all the rewarding health benefits that generosity provides, we should have no problem raising the annual budget of the church each year. The rewards are so great, we shouldn't even have to have stewardship campaigns, right? I asked our administrator, Leanne, to run some statistics for me this week. We have 1,846 families on the rolls as members of our church here at Myers Park Baptist, but unfortunately, only 515 contribute financially. That means only 28% of our members are giving. Less than that, only 17% have made a pledge to let us know what they're planning to give this year. These are pretty stunning statistics, I know, but I believe I know what the problem is, and I'm guilty of it myself. We look out at our amazing staff. We look at this beautiful sanctuary, our massive campus, our cutting-edge programs, our exceptional music, our incredible worship services, this extraordinary community of love that people all over the country would walk across hot coals to have in their city, and our minds engage in a kind of magical thinking. I do it too, I know. We all imagine that all this happens without money. It's very easy to think that, to come and think that we can do all this with nothing. We imagine that this is being paid for by somebody else with deep pockets. We imagine that what we have to give, what little we have to give, wouldn't really make a difference. But did you know if every member of our church who isn't currently giving started giving just $1 a day, if they gave $7 a week, you can't even get a cup of coffee at Starbucks for $7 anymore. If every member not giving now would give $1 a day, we'd have $500,000. And if every member who's already giving increased their giving by $20 a week, we'd have another $500,000. That is why we desperately need to free our minds from any kind of magical thinking. This stuff doesn't happen without money. That's the nature of the world we live in. I could get up in this pulpit for the next 3 weeks and tell you about all the wonderful rewards that giving to our church will have in your life. I could tell you that it will make you happier, that it will extend your life, that it will contribute to your mental health and psychological well-being. I could tell you that it would contribute to your fulfillment in life, and that it's better to give than to receive. I could tell you that your gifts will help expand our programs and help take care of our staff and provide the necessary funds for the upkeep of this beautiful sanctuary and this beautiful facility, and drastically increase all the good that we do in this community. And all that would be true. But there's only one problem. Jesus said we're not supposed to give so we can get something in return. Jesus said we're not supposed to give so that we can receive a reward. Giving so that we can receive something in return is not generosity, that's reciprocity. And everything in our society today has become transactional, including relationships, so much so that it's hard to imagine a kind of giving that is selfless and sacrificial without expectation of anything in return. But in the church, we're supposed to be imagining that all the time. It's called grace. That's what grace is. Has anybody received grace in this church? This is what we've gotten wrong over and over again throughout history as Christians. We keep talking about giving as if there's a reward, as if it's about the reward. We're not called to give so we can receive praise and prestige or notoriety like the hypocrites in the text that we read today. We're not called to give to appease the wrath of an angry God. We're not called to give so we can secure our ticket to heaven. We're not called to give so we can buy indulgences that spring our dead loved ones out of hell. We're not called to give so we can receive financial prosperity or health and wealth in this life, no matter what the liars at those other churches will tell you. We're not called to give so that we will be happy, live a long life, achieve mental health and psychological well-being, even though the scientists will tell you that that's what generosity can do. The pie-in-the-sky theology of our ancestors, the prosperity gospel of the present, the New Age spirituality of health and happiness, they are not what Jesus told us to do, and they are not what Jesus told us giving is for. These are all false gospels based in a toxic theology of rewards and punishments that uses carrots and sticks to try to motivate people to do the right thing. Are we not more spiritually evolved than that by now? Are we not people who have received grace and therefore want to give grace to others? Generosity is the virtue of giving good things to others freely and abundantly without expecting any reward or the prospect of receiving something in return. Generosity is the practice of giving to another person something that is ours as an act of free will without obligation. Generosity is the practice of being liberal and extravagant in our giving. Generosity is the decision to act in direct opposition to all the greed and hate and contempt and envy and anger and indifference in our world. And generosity is the only thing that has the power to break the deathly pattern of anxiety and fear and greed. The only thing that can get our minds off of ourselves and redirect our energies away from anxiety so we can focus on the work of loving our neighbors and make an investment in the common good of all people. Generosity is the only thing that can deliver us from the cycle of scarcity and free our lives for community. At the end of the day, the number one reason to be generous is that generosity is the activity that has the power to create community. The grace to create community. Without generosity, there is no community. Without generosity, there is no church. Without generosity, there is nothing but godless individualism, grotesque greed, and grueling loneliness. And so we give this thing called money so we can tell it what we want to do with it in the world, so we can tell it to make community in the world. We give because we know we belong to one another. We give because we know that we need each other. We give because we know that we love each other. We give because we care about this church and about this community. We give because generosity is the tie that binds us. We give because generosity is the fabric that connects us. We give because generosity is the mortar that unites us. We give because generosity is the glue that holds us together. We give because true generosity is grace. And grace has the power to liberate us all. Amen.